Hi Anine, this is your second lesson on the Cold War, and today we're going to be thinking about why a Cold War started in the late 1940s. Even though there was a lot of tension between the Allies at the end of 1945, a Cold War hadn't actually started yet. But by 1950, a Cold War had developed. There's no exact starting date because a Cold War is very different from a hot war. There's no direct fighting between the two sides. So historians disagree over when the Cold War actually started. Some say 1947, some say 1948. But certainly there was a Cold War by 1950. So today's lesson is going to be focused on why did a Cold War start in the late 1940s. If you get your book or your paper or your Word document, whatever you're working on, and write a title in, and then we can get started. So just to recap, first of all, there were strong ideological differences between the USSR and the USA. The USSR was a communist country, and in a communist country there is limited individual freedoms. So, for example, there's no freedom of speech, and the individual is less important than the community. So individuals don't get much private freedom. There's also no private wealth. Instead, everything is owned publicly. So people's quality of life was a little bit lower in a communist country, but there was also less inequality. In the USA, there was capitalism, and in a capitalist system, there was a democracy where people had a say over how they were governed, and they also had opportunities to gain wealth. So, for example, they could get a better education and therefore get a promotion, which might give them more money, or they could start a business, or they could buy a house, which then gains value. So people tended to live a slightly higher quality of life, but there was also much worse inequality. So some people were very, very poor, while some people were very, very rich. So both these countries, the USA and the USSR, had worked together to defeat Hitler. And at the end of the war, both wanted to increase their influence in Europe and Asia. So they went very quickly from being allies that were working very closely together to being effectively enemies, because they both had very different visions for what Europe and Asia's future should look like. Stalin wanted to make sure that communism was the strongest power in Eastern Europe in particular, and also in Asia, whereas America wanted to make sure that capitalism had a stronger influence in both Europe and in Asia. At the end of 1945, it seemed like the USA was going to be the more powerful force, as they had atomic power, so they had the atom bomb. And that meant it was the USSR had to act much more defensively, be much more cautious about their kind of dealings with America, because there was this threat there of the atom bomb, which had the potential to kill hundreds of thousands of people, and that atom bomb was there and could be used by the USA. So our question today is, why was there a Cold War by the late 1940s? A Cold War was different from a hot war. So I just want to talk briefly about the features of a Cold War. So a Cold War is a political struggle between two powers seeking global dominance, in which direct open war is avoided. So in a Cold War, the two sides are enemies, they disagree, and one is trying to be more powerful than the other. But it's not like in the Second World War or the First World War when one country invades another. The USA and the USSR never directly fought against each other. So the USA never declared war on the USSR and vice versa. However, there were lots of other things that happened. So, for example, the USA would send spies to the USSR to find out information, and the same the other way around. Both countries spent huge amounts of money on defence. What you can see in the top left here is something that the American government did, called the Strategic Defence Initiative, which was spending huge amounts of money on nuclear weapons. And also both sides made propaganda to kind of exaggerate the negatives of one country. So on the bottom right, you can see some propaganda that was made by the Soviet Union about the Americans. So there was a lot of conflict and a lot of tension, but there was never a declaration of war from one side to the other. And you'll look more on the methods that were used in the Cold War next lesson. So now we're going to, for the rest of the lesson, look at some events that led to the escalation of tensions and eventually the outbreak of Cold War. So your first task is to describe the Iron Curtain. You can do this by using the information on your screen. You just need to pause the video and write in full sentences to describe what the Iron Curtain was. Really important to remember, it's not a real Iron Curtain, it's an idea. So you need to describe what did the Iron Curtain actually mean. In response to the Iron Curtain, the Americans started something called the Truman Doctrine. So again, you just need to pause your video and answer the question, what was the Truman Doctrine? Next, you're going to look at the Berlin blockade and airlift. There's more information that you need to know about this. So if you go to Teams and open the information sheet and then read through the information and have a go at the questions. Pause your video now to do that. In 1949, an important event happened to shift the power balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. So in 1949, the Soviet Union were finally successful in developing their own atomic bomb. This meant that if the USA were to use an atomic bomb on the USSR, then the USA would then be bombed in return. This meant it was far less likely for either power to use the atomic bomb against each other, because both were equally powerful when it came to military strength, and therefore both were afraid to use that strength because they knew it would lead to a retaliation. So for the USSR, this increased their confidence significantly, but because between 1945 and 1949, there was this sense that the USSR was weaker than the USA. In contrast, the USA became much more concerned that they were now on equal footing with the USSR, and they were very worried that a nuclear war would break out. So I'm going to come back to this question, which you kind of looked at the end of last lesson. Why had a Cold War started by 1950? There is 4 different bullet points here. I want you to look at these 4 different bullet points and decide which do you think was the most important cause of the Cold War. When you've decided, write that bullet point out in your notes and then underneath explain why you think that was the most important cause. Remember, a Cold War is different from a hot war because there's not direct fighting. Instead, either side antagonises the other and does whatever they can to threaten the other. So write down which bullet point you think is the most important cause of the Cold War and then explain your answer underneath. Pause your video now to do this. So you could have put any answer for this, and it doesn't matter whichever one you've put as long as you've explained your point, but I just wanted to explain my point of view and why. So if it were me, I would put ideological differences being the most important, because the others, I think, are a product of the ideological differences. The USSR acted aggressively in Eastern Europe because they strongly believed that capitalist powers threatened them and threatened their existence. The USA tried to increase their influence in Europe because they were concerned about the influence that the Soviet Union was having. Before the Second World War, the USA hadn't tried to have an influence in Europe at all. It was only once they became concerned about the Soviet Union that they tried to do so. And also, the USSR and the USA both had atomic power, but that wouldn't have seemed anywhere near as dangerous if they were on the same side or if they didn't have these strong ideological differences. So I think that the ideological differences are the most important because they're the origin of the other aggressive acts. But as I say, it's fine whatever you've put. So well done Year 9, you have finished for this lesson and also finished your lessons for the week. So really, really good. Well done. Remember to keep your notes safe and enjoy the rest of your week.